At first glance, just an ordinary family and a farm. But one letter from their father changed everything. What's hidden under the old oak? Find out now. Comment where you're watching from. Like and subscribe. The Miller family farm lay silent beneath the pale Kansas sky. Its once golden fields now dull and lifeless. The barn door creaked in the wind. The fences leaned like weary old men, and the earth itself seemed to mourn along with the family that had called it home for generations. Andrew Miller stood at the edge of the porch, hands in his pockets, his eyes tracing the horizon, where the sun had begun to sink into a haze of orange dust. His father had been gone for only 2 weeks, yet it already felt like the world had aged years in his absence. The funeral had been simple, quiet, the way his father would have wanted. But when the last neighbor drove away and the sound of footsteps faded from the dirt road, what remained was silence and debt. The bank had been calling for months, warning them that time was running out. The crops hadn't been good for years, and with his father gone, the burden fell squarely on Andrew's shoulders. Inside the farmhouse, his sister Amy sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of papers, loan notices, overdue bills, and the wrinkled deed to the land. Their younger brother, Ben, leaned against the wall, his baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, avoiding the reality staring at them in black ink. The room smelled faintly of coffee and dust, a smell that once reminded them of mornings with their father, but now felt heavy and bitter. Amy spoke first, her voice low but steady. "We can't keep this place running, Andrew. We have to sell before it's taken from us." Andrew didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, and he stared out the window toward the old oak tree behind the barn, the one his father had planted before any of them were born. He could still hear his father's voice in his head, calm and sure. The land will always give back if you respect it. But the land had given nothing lately, and Andrew wondered if maybe his father had been wrong. The next morning, they met with the family's lawyer in town. Mr. Perkins, a round man with a kind face, handed Andrew a thick envelope sealed with wax. "Your father left you something," he said quietly. "Said you'd know when to read it." Andrew opened it there in the small, dim office, expecting to find instructions about the property or some last-minute advice about handling the debts. Instead, there was a single handwritten letter. The ink was faded in places, but the words were clear enough. His father's familiar script filled the page, ending with a single line that made Andrew frown. "Son, if you ever come to the point where you're ready to give up, dig under the old oak tree behind the barn." On the ride home, none of them spoke. Amy clutched the letter in her lap, rereading the final line over and over. Ben finally broke the silence. "You think he meant it literally?" Andrew didn't know what to think. His father wasn't a man of riddles or games, but the idea of digging for something felt almost childish. Still, there was something in those words, a quiet urgency, a purpose that wouldn't let go of him. That night, after everyone went to bed, he sat alone on the porch, staring at the silhouette of the oak against the starlit sky. The breeze carried the scent of dry grass and the faintest trace of rain, and he felt a strange calmness wash over him. The next day, Amy suggested calling the realtor again, ready to set things in motion. Andrew stopped her. "Wait," he said, his tone firm. "Before we do anything, I want to see what's under that tree." She gave him a tired look. "You think there's buried treasure out there?" "Dad wasn't some kind of storybook hero, Andrew. He was a farmer." "I know," Andrew said quietly. "But he was also a man who didn't waste words." That was enough to convince Ben. At least by evening, they gathered their tools, shovels, gloves, and a lantern, and walked out to the oak tree. The ground was cool and firm, still holding the memory of recent rain. As the first shovel struck the soil, the sound echoed through the quiet fields. They worked slowly, taking turns digging while the others watched. The rhythm of the shovels was steady, almost meditative, but as the minutes turned into hours, exhaustion crept in. Amy wiped the sweat from her forehead. "This is pointless," she muttered. Ben leaned on his shovel. "Maybe he buried something small like a box of keepsakes, or nothing," Amy interrupted. "Maybe it was just a metaphor." Andrew wanted to believe that, but something deep inside told him there was more. He looked up at the branches of the oak swaying gently in the wind, as if the tree itself were waiting. The sky grew darker, stars emerging one by one. Andrew's hands ached, blisters forming beneath his gloves. Still, he kept digging, driven by something he couldn't quite name. He remembered his father's hands, rough, scarred, but steady. He remembered the way he'd pause after a long day's work to look at the horizon, as if he were seeing something invisible to everyone else. When Amy finally said, "Let's call it a night," Andrew's shovel struck something solid. The metallic clang cut through the stillness, sharp and unmistakable. All three froze. Amy's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" Ben dropped to his knees and brushed away the loose dirt. Beneath the soil, the faint outline of rusted metal glimmered under the lantern light. Andrew's heart pounded as he knelt beside it, fingers trembling. Whatever it was, it had been buried there for years, maybe decades. The three of them stared at the ground, breathless, as the lantern flickered in the wind. For the first time since their father's death, hope flickered too, fragile, uncertain, but alive. Andrew looked at his brother and sister and whispered, almost afraid to believe it himself, "He left us something." The night air grew colder, but none of them moved. They just stood there in silence, the lantern light casting long shadows over the dug-up earth. The old oak tree loomed above them, its branches whispering softly as if it had been waiting all along for them to come. And as Andrew looked down at the buried object, he knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, the air felt different, heavy with curiosity and unease. Andrew barely slept, his mind replaying the metallic sound from the night before. He sat on the porch at sunrise, sipping black coffee that had long gone cold, staring toward the oak tree that now seemed to guard a secret meant only for them. Amy joined him a few minutes later, her hair tied back, her expression a mixture of fatigue and disbelief. "We probably just hit an old pipe," she said quietly, as if trying to convince herself. Andrew didn't answer. He knew his father wouldn't have written that note if there was nothing there. The man had never wasted words, and certainly not in his last message to his children. When Ben stumbled out with a shovel over his shoulder and a grin on his face, the mood lightened for a moment. "Well," he said, "are we going to finish what we started?" Amy sighed, but she grabbed her gloves anyway. Together, the three of them walked back to the oak, the early sun glinting off the dewy grass. The hole they dug the previous night gaped like an open wound in the earth, edges crumbling softly. Andrew felt his stomach twist. He wasn't sure what scared him more, that they might find nothing or that they might find something that changed everything. They started digging again. The soil was damp and cool, the scent of earth strong in the air. For an hour, all they heard was the scrape of metal on dirt and the rustle of leaves above them. At first, it seemed like they were wasting their time. Amy muttered about lost hours and foolish dreams. Ben kept joking to keep the silence away, but his voice grew quieter with every passing minute. Then Andrew's shovel struck the same spot again, producing that unmistakable metallic clang. This time the sound was clearer, sharper. They dropped to their knees and brushed the soil away with their hands until the rusted corner of a metal box emerged from beneath the dirt. It took both Andrew and Ben to lift it out. The box was old and heavy, covered in rust and patches of dried mud. Amy held the lantern closer, even though the morning light had already broken through the trees. "What if it's just junk?" she whispered. Andrew ran his fingers over the corroded surface. The box had no lock, only a latch that had nearly fused shut with time. After several tense moments, Ben pried it open with the edge of his shovel. The lid gave way with a dull crack, releasing a faint smell of age and earth. Inside, wrapped in layers of cloth, were several small canvas bags, their seams stiff and dark with dirt, and between them a folded envelope marked with one word in their father's handwriting. "For my children." Andrew's hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. For a moment, he just stared at it, feeling the weight of it in his palm. Amy leaned closer. "Open it," she said softly. Inside was a letter written in the same uneven script as the one they had found at the lawyer's office. The words were careful and deliberate. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I never wanted this land to be your burden. Our family has held on to it for generations. Not because it was easy, but because it carried our history. These coins were passed down to me from my grandfather. I buried them here so that when the time came, you would know where to look. Don't let go of this place. It has given us more than we ever realized." When Andrew finished reading, none of them spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the branches above. Ben was the first to reach into the box. He untied one of the bags and poured its contents onto the ground. Silver coins tumbled out, glinting faintly in the sunlight. They were tarnished and covered in dirt, but their details were still visible. Intricate designs, unfamiliar faces, and symbols that looked older than anything they had ever seen. Amy gasped quietly. "These look ancient," she said. Andrew picked one up and turned it over in his fingers. The metal was cold, the engraving delicate. Later that afternoon, they took a small sample of the coins to town. The antique shop on Main Street smelled of old wood and dust, filled with relics of forgotten times. The owner, Mr. Hendricks, a man in his 60s, with spectacles balanced on the end of his nose, examined the coins carefully under a lamp. His eyes widened as he traced the edges with a trembling finger. "Where did you find these?" he asked. Andrew hesitated before answering. "On our land," he said. "They belong to my father." Mr. Hendricks leaned back, clearly astonished. "These aren't ordinary coins. Some of them date back to the late 1700s, early settlers, maybe even older. They're worth a fortune, not just in money, but in history." The siblings stared at one another, speechless. For the first time in months, a sense of possibility filled the air. Mr. Hendricks told them he would connect them with a collector in Kansas City who specialized in early American currency. As they drove home, Amy looked out the window, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad knew exactly what he was doing. Andrew nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "He knew we'd give up one day," he said quietly, "and he made sure we wouldn't." That evening, the sunset painted the sky in deep orange and gold. The old oak stood tall against the horizon, its leaves glowing in the light. They buried the empty box again, not out of secrecy, but out of respect. The ground seemed to hum softly beneath their feet, as if the land itself was finally breathing again. Inside the farmhouse, Amy placed their father's letter in a frame on the mantel. Ben cleaned one of the coins and set it beside it, shining under the fading daylight. Andrew stood at the window, looking out toward the fields. The debt, the struggle, the grief. They were all still there. But now there was something else, too. Hope. As the stars appeared one by one, Andrew thought of his father's final words. The land had given back after all. And in that quiet Kansas night, he understood that what they had unearthed wasn't just silver buried in the ground. It was faith preserved by a man who had never stopped believing in the power of family and the promise of the earth. For days, the discovery under the old oak lingered in Andrew's thoughts like a dream he couldn't fully wake from. The metal box, the letter, the coins, all of it seemed almost unreal. Each morning he expected to find it gone, as if the earth had swallowed its secret back again. But it was real, and with it came a new kind of responsibility. Amy spent most of her time carefully cleaning the coins at the kitchen table, her movements delicate and precise, as though afraid they might crumble if handled too roughly. Ben, restless and wide-eyed, spent hours reading about coin collecting and the history of early American settlers on the old family computer. The farmhouse, which had been filled with silence and dread, now buzzed with quiet energy. Yet beneath that energy lay something else, a growing realization that their father had carried a secret far heavier than they'd ever imagined. Andrew sat in his father's study one evening, the same room where the old man used to balance the farm's accounts and listen to the evening news. Dust motes floated in the sunlight streaming through the window, and the smell of leather and old paper filled the air. On the desk beside a pile of farm ledgers, he found a small leather-bound notebook with his father's handwriting on the first page. Inside were short entries about crop yields, weather, and livestock, mundane details of farm life. But tucked between them were notes that caught Andrew's eye. The coins, family keepsake. Great-grandfather Jacob brought them from the East, said they came from an even older collection, traced back to settlers who helped build the first trading posts. Another line read, "If the land ever fails us, let the past remind them where they come from." Andrew closed the book slowly, his chest tightening. His father hadn't just hidden treasure. He had preserved a legacy. The next morning, they drove to Kansas City to meet the collector Mr. Hendricks had recommended. The office was in an old brick building near the riverfront, filled with glass cases displaying rare artifacts. The collector, a tall man named Robert Lang, examined the coins with a kind of reverence that made the siblings nervous. "These," he said finally, "are extraordinary. Late 18th century, maybe early 19th. Some are colonial issue. Some Spanish silver used in early trade before U.S. minting became widespread. I've seen only a handful like them in private collections. Amy leaned forward, her voice barely steady. Are they worth much? Lang smiled faintly. Individually, yes. But as a collection, with your family's provenance, they could fetch hundreds of thousands, maybe more at auction. The words hung in the air like a gust of wind that took their breath away. Ben let out a low whistle. Amy covered her mouth, and Andrew just stared, his heart pounding in disbelief. But there was more to it than the money. Lang asked if they had documentation, proof of origin, family records, anything that could link the coins to history. Andrew handed him the letter and the notebook. The collector read them carefully, then nodded with genuine respect. Your father was a wise man. He understood the value of preserving something that carries a story. These coins aren't just metal. They're a record of survival. On the drive back home, no one spoke for a long time. The wind through the open windows filled the silence, and the Kansas plains stretched endlessly around them, golden and endless beneath the afternoon sun. Finally, Amy said quietly, he knew we'd lose faith one day. He buried it so we'd find it when we needed it most. Andrew gripped the steering wheel tighter. He didn't save the farm with money, he said. He saved it with hope. That night, Andrew sat on the porch again, watching the fireflies flicker in the darkness. The oak tree stood tall against the horizon, its branches moving softly in the wind. He thought of his father kneeling there years ago, digging the same soil, hiding the box with hands calloused from work. He imagined the quiet determination in his father's eyes, the unspoken prayer that one day his children would understand. Behind him, he heard the screen door creak open. It was Amy. You think he knew we'd find it now? Not sooner, not later. Right now? Andrew looked at her and nodded. He always knew the timing of things. The rain, the planting, the harvest. Maybe he knew this, too. In the following days, the family worked to appraise and prepare the coins for sale. Robert Lang agreed to handle the transaction, promising to ensure that part of the collection would be preserved in a museum, while the rest could be sold to cover the farm's debts. Each step felt surreal. The people who came to see the coins treated them like relics, whispering about their beauty and rarity. Yet for the Millers, they were something more intimate, a bridge between generations. Amy often said it felt like their father was still guiding them, steadying their hands when they doubted themselves. When the first payment came through, enough to pay off the bank and repair the barn roof, Amy broke down in tears. Ben hugged her, laughing through his own disbelief. Andrew stood by the window, watching the fields as the evening light rolled over the land like a blessing. But even as relief settled in, a quiet sorrow lingered. Andrew couldn't shake the thought of what his father must have felt when he decided to bury the coins. The fear of losing everything, the weight of knowing his children would face hard times, the hope that they would one day rise above it all. It wasn't just foresight. It was love made tangible, sealed in the earth. One evening, after finishing the last of the paperwork, Andrew walked out to the oak tree again. The ground was smooth where they had filled the hole, the grass already starting to grow back. He placed his hand on the trunk, rough and warm beneath his fingers. This place used to scare me, he said quietly. Now it feels like him. The wind rustled through the leaves, and for a moment, it sounded almost like a voice. He closed his eyes and let the feeling wash over him. Grief, gratitude, peace. Behind him, the farmhouse lights glowed softly in the dark, and he could hear the faint laughter of his siblings inside. For the first time since his father's passing, the sound didn't hurt. It felt right, like the land was alive again, breathing along with them. When he turned back toward the house, the moonlight caught the fields, casting a silver shimmer across the rows of soil. Andrew smiled faintly. His father had left them silver in the ground. But what he'd truly given them was something far more valuable, a way to start again, to believe again, to remember that the roots of a family run deeper than the earth itself. The first light of dawn spilled across the Kansas fields, painting the land in shades of gold and pale pink. A year had passed since Andrew and his siblings had dug beneath the old oak tree, and the Miller farm no longer looked like a place on the brink of ruin. The fences were new. The barn roof gleamed red again, and the scent of tilled soil carried promise instead of despair. Andrew stood by the window of the farmhouse, a mug of coffee warming his hands, and listened to the sounds he had missed for so long. The low hum of the tractor, the laughter of his brother and sister outside, the creak of the porch steps that had once only echoed emptiness. It felt like the land itself had woken from a long sleep, and in every corner of it lived the memory of their father's steady hands and quiet faith. Amy came into the kitchen, wiping flour from her palms, her apron dusted white from baking. "The bread's almost done," she said with a smile that reached her eyes this time. The air smelled of yeast and warmth, just as it had when their mother was alive. Ben burst through the door, his boots muddy, his face flushed from work. "Northfield's almost ready," he announced proudly. "We'll be planting early this year." Andrew nodded, pride swelling quietly in his chest. The farm had come back to life piece by piece, built again, not by luck or money alone, but by the determination his father had always hoped they'd find within themselves. Later that morning, they gathered in the living room, where sunlight streamed through clean windows. Above the fireplace hung a simple wooden frame holding their father's final letter. The paper had yellowed slightly, but the ink remained bold, his message forever clear. Next to it, on the mantel, rested one of the old coins, polished now, its silver glow soft but strong. It wasn't a symbol of wealth anymore, but of endurance, of family, of faith that had refused to die. Amy touched the frame lightly. "He's still here," she whispered. Andrew nodded. He never left. They didn't need to say more. Every repaired board, every row of sprouting crops, every breath of wind through the oak leaves outside carried his presence. As spring deepened, the days filled with work. The soil was fertile again, and with each seed they planted, they felt as if they were restoring something sacred. Andrew spent long evenings walking the fields, watching the sun set behind the barn. The horizon burned orange and gold. And in those quiet moments, he would close his eyes and imagine his father standing beside him, hands on his hips, that familiar half-smile on his face. He could almost hear him say, "You did good, son." The ache in Andrew's chest that once felt unbearable had softened into something gentler, a memory that no longer hurt but healed. One evening after supper, the three of them sat on the porch together. Fireflies blinked across the fields, and the air was thick with the scent of cut grass. Ben leaned back in his chair looking up at the stars. "Do you ever think about how close we were to losing it all?" he asked. Amy exhaled, her voice quiet. "Every day? But maybe we had to lose something to find what mattered." Andrew looked out toward the oak tree, its branches swaying against the twilight sky. "Dad knew we'd reach that point. He said he didn't just save us with those coins. He reminded us what it means to keep faith when everything feels lost." The words hung in the air, carried off by the breeze, and for a long while, none of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full, alive, peaceful. Weeks later, the harvest began. The fields glowed under the summer sun, golden waves stretching to the horizon. Neighbors came to help, as they had in better times, and laughter echoed across the land. The farm that once stood as a symbol of failure now stood as proof of endurance. In the evenings, after the last wagon was unloaded, Andrew would sit beneath the oak tree, feeling the rough bark against his back. The grass had grown thick again over the spot where they had dug, erasing the scar of the hole, but he could still trace its outline in his mind. Sometimes he would rest his hand on the ground and whisper a quiet thank you, not for the silver they'd found, but for the strength that came with it. On the last day of harvest, as the sun dipped low and the fields shimmered in the fading light, Amy brought out dinner to the porch, fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and sweet tea in their mother's old glasses. They ate together, talking and laughing, the sound carrying softly across the land. When the plates were cleared and the stars began to appear, Andrew stood and walked once more to the oak tree. The night was still, the air warm and gentle. He looked up at the branches stretching toward the sky and spoke softly, almost as if in prayer. "We made it, Dad. The farm's alive again. You were right. The land gives back if you respect it." He stood there for a long time, listening to the rustling leaves, feeling the steady pulse of the earth beneath his boots. When he turned to go, he glanced back one last time, and the moonlight caught the tree in a silver glow, just enough to make the ground shimmer faintly. It felt like a sign, quiet and certain. He smiled to himself and walked back toward the house where the warm light from the windows spilled out into the night. Inside, laughter and the smell of bread welcomed him home. And as he closed the door behind him, Andrew knew that his father's lesson had taken root, not just in the soil, but in their hearts. The treasure they had uncovered had saved the farm, but the true inheritance was far greater: the unbreakable bond between family, the resilience to rebuild, and the faith that even after loss, life could begin again. The autumn wind swept across the Kansas plains, carrying with it the scent of dry leaves and the promise of another season turning. The Miller farm stood proud against the horizon, the fields harvested and resting, the barn freshly painted, and the farmhouse glowing with a steady, quiet life. Andrew walked the path toward the old oak tree, his boots crunching softly over the fallen leaves. A year had passed since the discovery that changed everything. Yet the memory of that night felt as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. The cold earth, the glint of metal beneath the soil, the disbelief that turned to awe. But now there was no disbelief, no uncertainty, only gratitude. The farm was alive again, and so was the family. The debts were paid, the land was theirs once more, and peace had returned to the place that had once been filled with fear and silence. Andrew reached the tree and placed his hand against the rough bark, the same way his father used to. The wood was warm from the late afternoon sun, solid and strong. Above him, the leaves whispered softly in the wind, and he felt as though the tree itself was speaking in a language only his heart could understand. He thought about the man who had planted it, about the years it had stood guard over the land and the family, and about the secret that had lain buried beneath its roots. It wasn't just a hiding place. It had been a message, one his father had written in the language of faith and patience. Andrew smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes creasing as he whispered, "You knew, didn't you? You knew this would bring us back together." Behind him, Amy's voice called out from the house, carried by the wind. "Dinner's ready." He turned to see her waving from the porch, her figure framed by the warm light spilling through the windows. Ben was already setting the table inside, laughing about something that echoed faintly across the yard. Andrew raised a hand in reply, but before heading back, he stayed a moment longer beneath the oak. The world was quiet, except for the rustling of the leaves, the distant cry of a hawk, and the soft hum of the land preparing for winter. He thought of all that had happened: the fear, the exhaustion, the discovery, and the slow rebuilding, and realized that the real treasure wasn't the silver they had found, but the strength they had forged through it. As the sun dipped lower, the light turned golden, and the shadows stretched long over the ground. Andrew looked toward the horizon, the fields glowing softly in the dusk. He could almost see his father standing there at the edge of the rows, hat pulled low, hands on his hips, that familiar look of quiet pride on his face. For a moment, Andrew let himself believe it was real. "We did it, Dad," he said softly. "The farm's safe. We're okay now." The breeze picked up, gentle but sure, and the leaves above him rustled in a way that sounded like a sigh of relief. It was enough. He didn't need words or signs. He just knew. He walked back toward the farmhouse, each step steady, each breath full. As he reached the porch, the smell of home-cooked food met him: fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and the faint sweetness of apple pie. Inside, laughter filled the air. Amy looked up as he entered and smiled. "You talking to him again?" she asked softly. Andrew nodded, taking his seat at the table. "Always." They bowed their heads together before eating. A simple gesture, but one that carried the weight of everything they had been through. Outside, the first stars began to appear, shimmering faintly above the wide, open fields. After dinner, Andrew stepped outside once more. The night was cool and clear, the kind of calm that seemed to settle deep into the soil itself. From the porch, he could see the oak tree silhouetted against the starlit sky, its branches reaching upward as if embracing the heavens. He thought of the coins now stored safely in town, of the framed letter above the fireplace, and of the way the farm had come back to life. But most of all, he thought of how his father's lesson had become the foundation of their future, that no matter how deep the loss, no matter how heavy the burden, faith and love could always bring something back to life. He sat down on the porch steps, listening to the quiet hum of the crickets, the occasional rustle of wind through the grass, the steady heartbeat of a home reborn. Somewhere in that stillness, he felt the same peace that had once eluded him for so long. He looked toward the oak one last time and smiled. "Thank you," he whispered into the night, "for everything." Then he rose, opened the door, and stepped inside where warmth, light, and family waited for him. Behind him, the oak tree swayed gently in the wind, standing tall against the stars, a silent guardian of the land, a monument to the past and a promise to the future. And in that quiet Kansas night, the farm finally rested, whole again, the way it was always meant to be. The story has come to an end. Or maybe it's just the beginning. If you enjoyed it, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit like and subscribe. There are more unforgettable stories on the way.